Welcome back. Some of the most difficult conversations about race and racism can actually be the ones we have with our kids. It's so important to not shy away from these conversations. So we brought in a panel of parents now to dive into the ways we can talk to our kids and teach them to be anti-racist from a young age. Please welcome Julia Grieve, Tanya Hales, Sarah Gunn, and Heather Greenwood Davis. Hi, everyone. Heather, I'm going to start with you. I like that you say this conversation is like the sex talk. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but a necessary one.
Yeah, you know, sometimes in our quest to be a good parent who encourages open and honest conversation, you're going to get uncomfortable. My husband and I have really made this conscious decision that we were going to raise these kids who felt they could talk to us about anything. And as a result, I've had very uncomfortable questions come at me at the most inopportune times. But you know what? It's so important. It's important to be uncomfortable. I think people feel like if they can avoid these conversations around race or sex or whatever it may be, that the kids are going to somehow absorb what they need to know through osmosis. And the experts that I've spoken to are very clear that if you're not talking about it with your kids, they're likely getting it from somewhere else.
That's right. Okay, Sarah, how do you get the boys to talk?
Well, we're like Heather. We talk about everything in our house, whether people want to or not. We're very open. But in this situation, I feel like what's most effective is actually getting stories, perspectives, and insight from other kids. I find when the kids watch this, they connect with it because it's happening to people their age in their communities. It's real and they see it. And then that kind of lights that fire underneath them that this is an urgent issue. And they start asking, what can we do? What should we do? So it leads to those kinds of conversations too.
Okay, Julia, let's talk a little bit about how the Black Lives Matter movement really opened your eyes for your family and became sort of a discussion topic about white privilege.
Yeah, you know what, Tracy, I think it's the best way to say it. It's just really eye-opening. I mean, I grew up in a house where my mom was a English as a second language teacher. So we were, you know, we just really didn't really see color in our family. Everybody was the same. All of our friends, everybody was exactly the same. I lived in a very multicultural area. My church was very multicultural. So I just always assumed everybody was on the same playing field. And now, you know, you really see that that is not the case. And I think that is what's really come to fruition for me, for my family. And those are the conversations that we're having in our house.
But in the 80s was a time when we were all taught we were supposed to pretend to be colorblind. So you're not alone. I remember I had a babysitter, my Auntie Joan, white woman, but I literally thought she was my aunt. And one Christmas, she's very crafty. She made my sister and I black dolls, and she made us stockings, and one was a black Santa and one was a white Santa, and that meant the world to me. And it didn't mean that I was different in a bad way. It meant that she saw me. And I think that's the problem with colorblindness. You're not seeing the person and you're not seeing their journey, right? So Tanya, you say parents have to start to build their toolbox and be equipped to have these talks. So what do you mean by that?
So you can't teach what, you don't know. You can't teach someone else to tie their shoelaces if you don't know how to tie your own shoelaces. So when we're talking about this learning and listening that everyone is doing, you have to learn. So you have to find the books, find the resources, find the people that you need to reach out to, especially if your circle isn't very diverse with different perspectives. And it's not just necessarily race-based, but, culturally, where are these people from? Black people in Africa and Black people in the Caribbean, Black people in Toronto, those are three very different groups of people. So you really have to build your own toolbox and be prepared for when your children ask you questions, because they will pop up out of nowhere with them.
You also say, let the kids lead. What do you mean by that?
My son, he's notorious for asking me random questions when I'm driving. They're like, hey, Mom, what's X? And I'd be like, wait, hold on a second. And so you have to be prepared to meet your children where they are, right? My son is 8. He sees that I'm always doing these interviews, so he's pretty engaged, but he'll ask random questions. Parents know their children best.
You also say, Tanya, make it age appropriate. Why is this important?
Well, for the exact same reasons, right? You wouldn't teach your 8-year-old child calculus. You would start with the basics of, adding and subtraction and arithmetic. So, it is really important because it won't resonate the same way. The type of conversations, what they have access to. Teenagers have phones. My son doesn't have a smartphone yet. So you really just have to be mindful of how old they are and where they're coming from.
Sarah, I know you had a question that you would like to pose to the panel.
I would. I'd just like to know when everyone started talking to their children about race. I think it's important for non-Black families to hear when Black parents are talking to their children about this concept of race and any kind of preparation that you may have to, unfortunately, prepare your kids for. What age is that starting? Because I think we need to hear that so that we're starting those same conversations with our kids at the same age so that they are aware, they have the knowledge and the power to hopefully help do something about it.
Well, from my perspective, and then I'll let the other moms jump in, but the race conversation started when the sex conversation started, which means it started when they were just out of diapers. Eva was obsessed with skin color in junior kindergarten, to the point where her teacher said to me, well, Tracy, she's drawing the family and you're yellow and they're brown, and she's always talking about people's skin color. And so that was our entrance to this discussion on colorism and how there are different shades and how are people treated when there are different shades. Sydney coming home and telling me he was called the N-bomb, elementary school, at a Toronto camp, and now in middle school. These are all topics of conversation for us to talk about race. And right now we're in an environment where you have multiple opportunities. Look at the world. It's in the news, it's everywhere. But I'm going to ask Heather. Heather, how early did you start with your boys?
I mean, as early as they were asking a question or something was coming up in a book, for sure. And I think what happens often is that we parent, at least in part, in the way that we were parented. And I can recall with my own parents that, there will be incidents that someone from another race may not look at and immediately recognize as racism. But, my mom would point out if she was standing in a bank line and suddenly, a white man behind her was called forward in front of her. She would say to me, why do you think that happened? She would ask those kinds of questions, So I think it's important that as a parent, you're calling out racism when you see it. At any age, in an age-appropriate way, of course. But I think you've got to call it out, and it starts early.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your questions, for all of the work you are doing, for the conversations you're having with your family. Thank you, Julia, Tanya, Sarah, and Heather, for joining us and sharing with us. Great conversation.